I'm Jason Harris of Jason's Connection, and today we're talking to Tim Vogt of Starfire. Okay, I know you hate this question, but what got you into disability services?
I went to Northern Kentucky University,
Mm-hmm.
and after my freshman year, I spent a summer uh, partying as much as I possibly could, and after my sophomore year, I decided that that might not be a good idea to repeat that.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to the career guidance office and at NKU and I said, how could we? Okay, so went to the career guidance office at NKU and I said,
Mm-hmm.
what do you have that would get me out of town for a summer? And they
Mm-hmm.
said, how about some summer camps? And they
Mm-hmm.
gave me two brochures.
Mm-hmm.
One was to teach rich kids how to yacht up east,
Mm-hmm.
and the other was to work at a camp for people with disabilities out in California.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that California sounded wonderful, and so I signed up. And I spent the summer at a place in Santa Cruz called Camp Harmon, which was an Easter Seals camp. And just naturally, just kind of found my place. It was a great experience. We had a really great time. I had a lot of formative experiences working with and knowing and spending time with people with that label.
Mm-hmm.
And then ever since then, I was hooked. I came back to Cincinnati at the end of the summer to finish up my schooling and got a job at Cincinnati Recreation Commission and then got a job at Starfire.
And can you explain because Starfire is actually an evolving process. What it was when you first got there, and what have you started to transform it into, and what are your plans as that goes forward?
Sure, that's a really great question,
Yeah.
and it's one of it's an evolution, just like you said.
Mm-hmm.
When we started at Starfire, when I started there, my job was to double the outings. They ran about
Mm-hmm.
45 outings for people with disabilities, and the outings would be about 6 people with disabilities, a volunteer from the community, and a staff.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to double the amount of people with disabilities, so I had to double the number of outings, and I had to double the number of volunteers. And I did that. So I got us up to
Mm-hmm.
about 100 outings a month. All over the city. They would go volunteer, we would have big dances, we would have bowling parties, and around about 2008, I started to have some mentors and some people that started to help me see that there was another side of the disability story, and what we kind of came to understand was that there was some next steps to take. That while the first part of Starfire's history was about helping people have fun and be in the community,
Mm-hmm.
the next step would be how to help people develop meaning and be of the community and belong.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we've been working on over the last roughly 6 or 7 years, is how to undo the structures and patterns of thought that we used to have, and then to really build new structures and new patterns of thought. So real quickly, it would be about not seeing ourselves
Mm-hmm.
as the end point. So before we used to say, people with disabilities would come to us, do their outing, and go home. So we were always the end point for that experience.
Mm-hmm.
Now we think of ourselves as the connector to other people and the beginning point to new relationships. Okay, so that would be one big difference. The second difference is we used to identify everybody connected to Starfire either by whether they had a disability or didn't.
Mm-hmm.
If you had a disability, you were receiving services. If you didn't, you were a volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
Now we would say everybody connected to Starfire is a community builder,
Mm-hmm.
and our only role is to support them in getting connected to the right network of people where they can make that happen. So we really try to unthink the disability mindset around our work. So those would be two big shifts. As far as where we're taking it into the future, within 2 years from now, we will have closed all of our outings, the outing program that I just discussed that we had done, and we will close our day programs. So everything that groups people with disabilities together will be shut by July 1st, 2017. That's been a very hard process, as that we've all had to go through some degree of loss and soul searching, and then to develop our strength around the future vision, which is that we will work with one person and their family and their unique identity at a time, and help them grow into their next story or their new story. So in the future, what we are is we're connectors, we're neighbors, we're community builders, we're free agents. We can work with anybody anywhere, as opposed to just having to be concentrated just around the label of disability. Not that that's a bad thing. It's just that it's a limiting thing. And we found that when we concentrate our work around that whole thing around disability, it traps the person that we're trying to spring out of that label. It traps them in that disability story. So if we unlabel ourselves, then the people that we support can spring out.
Now, I'm sure, I mean, some people would just be, I mean, hearing the outing and stuff, I'm sure some people would be just happy with that. Has there been some backlash to some of this? Or?
Absolutely, you know, and again, it speaks to the evolution of what you kind of referenced before, is that, you know, back in the if you look at the history of the disability story, I mean, it used to be that, you know, people were really considered lucky if they were even alive. And so our society would put people in prison, or they would put people in the institutions, the big giant hospitals of the 30s and 40s and 50s. And the awareness and the mindset around that was, oh, we've got to change this. Now, those things are still alive today, smaller versions mostly, or versions that look like Starfire. I mean, Starfire is still an institution, you know, it still is a place where disability is used to categorize people and put programs around people. So it's a constant kind of evolution. And the thing is that people need something to wrap their minds around, a program or a cause or an identity. And since that disability has been given to them as an identity from the birth, them and their families and their neighbors and their schools and their teachers, they all see disability as a shortcut to identity, instead of letting that identity unfold over time as people grow and become someone new through learning or through relationships. So really, letting go of the disability identity is it's hard for people, you know. It means that I would have to do things in a new way. And I personally and professionally have experienced the challenge of this. You said, wow, boy, I built my whole career on disability as people's identity. What would that mean if I have to let that go, right? And when I listen to people who are trying to bust out of the disability themselves, the disability story themselves, they say, you know, it's not hard for me to let go of the disability identity because I'm excited and I know who I am. It's mostly harder for everyone else, the professionals and the families and the friends. So with our evolution, we had to ask people to stop coming to Starfire and start knowing their neighbors. Well, that's a scary thing, right? We don't have the social confidence very, very often in our times to just go out and know the people around us. We think that everybody's out to get us, or we watch the news and that teaches us that we should be afraid to leave our houses. And that's the very thing that would counteract the isolation and the loneliness that a lot of people experience, not just people with disabilities, but everybody. So if our work is about neighbors and about connecting and about knowing people and loving people, well, then we're asking people to take a risk. The ironic thing is that they always come back with, you know, you're asking us to trust in something that's not very reliable. You're asking us to trust in relationship and love.
Mm-hmm.
And those things are so intangible,
Mm-hmm.
and they take so much work to build that they can feel fragile.
Mm-hmm.
But what's fascinating is that people have forgotten that those are actually the things that last.
Yeah.
Right? Like your
Mm-hmm.
families and your friendships are the things that are there for you without costing any money.
Mm-hmm.
And then services, people somehow have this confidence
Mm-hmm.
that they are stable and solid and reliable.
Mm-hmm.
But services are always changing. The people
Mm-hmm.
that work in them are always changing.
Mm-hmm.
So the ironic thing is that people see relationships and love as something that's wishy-washy or not very solid.
Mm-hmm.
And then they see these services as something that's solid, when in reality the experience would be exactly the opposite. Of the services often let me down, they don't get me there on time, or they don't show up, or they're not as good as I thought they were going to be. And when I'm at my lowest point, my family and my friends and my wife or whoever was there for me, but I would have to invest in that. And I think that probably at its core, my guess is that the investment
Mm-hmm.
is what scares people the most. That's where we get the backlash, is we're asking people to invest in relationships, which means that you have to give and you have to receive.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be strong and you have to be vulnerable. You have to say, I need help here,
Mm-hmm.
or I trust in you, or I call you on your birthday and I get together with you and I make time for you. So it may seem it's a lot easier for me to just pay you to hang out with me.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder for me to hang in with you on your tough days, and to ask you to hang in with me on my tough days. So there's a cost to relationships, which I think is well worth it.
Yeah. I think most people would agree with that.
They would, but I think that's what it is it's a new way of thinking about relationships. It's getting back to some very old things in our world, and our modern world is kind of an instant gratification kind of thing, and so something that's going to take 30 or 40 years to cultivate doesn't seem like it fits.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're asking people to invest in.
I like it though, because a lot of times when people come up with old ideas, they have the same old idea. This is the way it was done back then, so this is the way we should do it now. It seems like this idea, even though it's looking at the past, is also adapting to the future.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if we think of our world as very impermanent, people can move wherever they want, and people can throw things away and buy new ones pretty cheaply, then the idea that you would invest in something long term almost seems counterculture, or like, renegade or radical. But it's really just the most timeless thing that we have. Like, since the dawn of time, there have been relationships. That's why we're all here today.
Yeah.
So to really invest in those intentionally, I think is a pretty important thing in 2015.
So who would you say has inspired you, or really important relationships for you, either in the past, because I think there's some that we can hold, or even now?
That's a good question. I was fortunate to have, I remember the night, so first of all, I think there are people that can give you a vision of something different, and they can inspire you that way. They can also kind of challenge you, and so I think those things are really good. Like, one of my moments of understanding came when I was invited to hear a woman named Judith Snow speak. And Judith is from Canada and travels the world, gives speeches on inclusion, and herself experiences a disability. She's quadriplegic, and she's just brilliant, though. And she was coming here to speak, and I'd never heard her name. She was at the Hebrew Union College up there in Clifton. And she was introduced by a guy named John McKnight, and he was introduced by a guy named Peter Block that lives here in Cincinnati. At the time, that was 2007, 2008, I had not heard any of their names. And I walk into a room, and Peter Block gets up and welcomes everybody, and he says, "Hey, Cincinnati, we have a new story to tell." He says, "It's not about Marge Schott and Pete Rose and race riots." He says, "It is about who each of us can be as citizens and how we get together and tell the new story of Cincinnati." And I was like, what's this guy talking about? Of course our story is Marge Schott and Pete Rose and race riots. That's all we talk about ourselves. We have this whole Mark Twain 20 years behind the time quote that we tell about ourselves, right? And then he introduces John McKnight, who's from Chicago and is the basically the inventor of asset-based community development. So looking at the strengths of people and places versus their problems. And John says, beware of people who profit off of other people's misery. And he described it this way. He said, I have a bad heart. He said, to the hospital in Chicago where I go, that is worth $500,000. But it's not worth anything to my family and my neighbors. And so he was pointing out this whole industry we built around care. And I remember hearing this, and I was like, oh my gosh, I think he's talking about me. I think he's talking about the service system. And then he introduced Judith, and Judith gets up there and she just basically says, look, people, there's no such thing as disability. It's all about gifts. Each one of us has something to offer the world, and we better figure out how to show it. And I left that night thinking, who are these hippies and what are they talking about? You know, I was really just kind of shocked by all those messages, and I really felt very challenged. So, but I started reading some of John's books and Peter's books, and I'm fortunate to get to know both those guys. And Judith, I've read some of her books and have gotten to know her as well, and they've really been helpful, especially that night as a vision of something different. That same night, I sat in a small group with Jo Krippenstapel, and she lives here in Cincinnati. And a couple different interactions afterward with her, she said, I went to a meeting, and she says I was like there, and this guy was talking about how his name is David Petoniak, and he was visiting from Vermont, and he has a theory that the things that we call behaviors around people with disabilities are really just ways of communicating and describing some sort of unmet need. So I'm not having a behavior, I really just want more control in my life. Or I'm feeling sick and I don't know how to tell anybody. Or I want to give back to the world and I haven't been able to discover that, which is a great way of thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
When you really think about it, all of our behaviors come from something we're trying to tell people. And Jo says I was like so challenged by this that she was like, I need to talk to that guy. And so she started taking me out to coffee once a month, and that's been going on for about 6 years. And she gradually, she's been in this work for about 30 or so years, and she gradually just kind of introduced different articles and ways of thinking as I was starting to understand what we would have to do at Starfire to really get to a much better place as an organization. She would help me think about that and help me think about how I was going to help others think about that. So I had that mentor, that really strong kind of hand-holding mentor that was an example. These days, I'm still learning from those same people, but I'm also learning a lot just from like observing the world and seeing what it has to teach us. I have this experience lately with a young man who is a little boy who's in my son's grade. He's actually in his class, and this little boy uses a wheelchair, and I've been noticing how close he and my son are. They're good friends, and I was excited this year because my son wanted to be on his little league team, and I was like, all right, good, inclusion, right? And so I was jogging, and I ran into this little boy's grandmother down the street, and she says, oh, hey, how's it going? I said, it's great. I said, how was spring break? She says, oh, it was great. You know, my grandson had his first baseball game last week. And I was like, oh, that's weird. You know, I thought I had missed a deadline or something. And she says, no, he joined the Miracle League.
Oh, yeah.
And the Miracle League is way up north of the city, and she said it's an awesome experience. The machine swings the bat for him, and he doesn't have to do anything, and he can do it all on his own. And she thought this was awesome. And she says, you ought to bring your son to come cheer him on next time. And I said, okay, I'll think about it. And so I was jogging home, and I was really like thinking about this, and it just kind of hit me that what I've noticed about my son and her grandson is that they are really good friends, and they don't see each other as different. But if I brought my son to his Miracle League game, I do worry that my son would start to see him as different. And so that's a real challenge to me these days. And like it's a good teacher. It's a good teaching experience in that I'm also noticing that wouldn't it be great if I could just accept that he's in that league and all those people are in that league and it's all cool, but I really
Yeah.
know that it'll change the way my son and his son's relationship plays out.
Mhm.
Funny enough, this past weekend we were down at the baseball league, baseball field in Bellevue where I live, and he was down there with his brother, and my two boys and he and his brother were playing catch,
Mhm.
and my son would catch the ball and put it in his glove,
Mhm.
and then he would zoom his wheelchair over to the person that he wanted to throw it to and drop the ball into that person's glove.
Mhm.
And they played catch like that for about 30 minutes. And it was really instructive to me because what I noticed is that the Miracle League helps him do it on his own.
Mhm.
Where actually, that's not what I would hope for his life.
Yeah.
I would hope that he has a lot of relationships that help him do the things that he needs help with,
Yeah.
and that he can also give back to. By being in the Miracle League, his relationships now shrink,
Mhm.
and they become smaller and they become related to his disability.
Mhm.
Whereas when he's tossing at the field down in Bellevue, it's him giving back and being a part of the 4 boys that are down there.
Mhm.
And they can help him and he can help them. And he grows up with a bigger network and a bigger identity of his own. So these days I'm really learning from just people living their lives, and I'm really trying to pay attention to what I hear in that. And what I hear from his grandmother is she wants to see him succeed, and she thinks that success depends on him hitting a ball independently. Whereas I would say success depends on him growing with a bunch of friends locally versus having to drive 45 minutes away
Yeah.
to participate in a mechanical version of baseball. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think people would say, well, what role does independence then play? Is there a role for him to be somewhat independent? Where does it a community, but also having independence? Because I think what people would say is, well, when does it become self-reliance on other people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an awesome question, and what you're getting to is the core value I think we have to hold in this work, which is avoiding the temptation to make an either or,
Yeah.
or to say that everyone must always. So within that little boy's life, there is a lot of opportunities for independence, right? Maybe academically, but maybe in baseball he's going to need some help, right? Whereas, maybe for somebody else, they really don't need any help in baseball and they need help in academics. So the temptation is to make a rule that all people must only be in community and must never, ever, ever join anything that's related to disability.
Yeah.
I wouldn't make that rule. I would say, though, that being aware of what you're doing and knowing that it's decided upon based on who that person is. In his case, it's interesting to me because he's only 7.
Yeah.
And I worry about what happens to a 7-year-old as they grow smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
But in somebody else's case, if somebody's 20 and they want to participate in an adaptive sports league because they love the competition of it, totally fine. In his case, he's having that decision made at a very early age, and I just think that limits the opportunities. But again, I would never go to his mom and dad and be like, "Hey, you must change the way you live." That's their choice, and so it's all wrapped up: independence, dependence, and choice, and how do I participate in the world?
I think that brings up some good points with a lot of service agencies, not just disability, that they have models and they get sort of so stuck in them that it becomes more about the model than the individual in some ways.
Yeah, you're talking about programs, right?
Yeah.
At Starfire, that's what we did. The first half of our history was how do we build programs? So if you're a member of Starfire, you have to have a disability, and then you sign up for outings, and then you go on those outings, and you go home.
Yeah.
Whereas now we're trying to build an unprogram where it's like, well, who are you?
Yeah.
And how do you then make a contribution to the world in your own unique way? just doesn't allow a lot of space for individuality.
Yeah, well, even with skills-based things, I think sometimes it could be you have to do it this way.
Right.
You have to do, this is the way that we do it, this is the way that we see best, this is the way that you must do it. And
Right.
that for people that can be really tough if that's not the way you learn or if that's
Right.
not the way that works for you or some other way. I think, sometimes you see so many organizations and they really try hard, but it becomes more about this is what the organization says you can do than what works for you.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's going to be a challenge of social
Yeah.
services into the future is
Mhm.
how do you become about liberating people from your idea of what they should be doing
Mhm.
to supporting people and to living into their idea of what they should be doing.
Mhm.
That'll be a huge challenge.
I think another thing, and I think a lot of this goes into it, and I was lucky enough to go in with your wife and a couple other people from Starfire to go to a conference on social role valorization. And can you explain what that is and how it really affects everybody?
Sure. Well, that's a huge topic.
Yeah.
You spent 4 days on
Yeah.
it, right? So we got like 4 minutes or something. Basically, the world we all value and devalue each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so for people who are in danger of being on the margins of communities, the most important thing that we can remember is to build up their credibility and build up their image. Help them be seen as contributing members of the world. And really, it's really about all of ourselves. How do we help each other? So my mentor, Jo, who I just mentioned, she always says,
Yes.
speak well about people behind their backs,
Mhm.
right? And that way you build up their credibility with other people. And when you have more value in the eyes of the world, then you get more opportunities.
Mhm.
And when you get more opportunities, you get a better life. So really, it's about perceived value, building into society's definition of whatever that is, and then to get the opportunities to showcase yourself, and then to build a good life full of relationships and opportunities and work and contribution and all kinds of vivid liveliness.
Thank you. So you're also, and you've talked about this, big on community. Can you talk about what you've done in your own community in Bellevue, Kentucky?
Sure. I do believe that local is the way to go, especially for the disability story, just because people typically cannot drive.
Yeah.
And I also believe that local relationships are more sustainable. So we've noticed that we need to build on local relationships back home. So we've started a garden. We've helped some people be involved in some other things there, like potlucks, just all kinds of creative ways to get neighbors mixed up in each other's lives.
And that is for everybody in Bellevue.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool. And can you, with the last couple, what sort of hobbies, talents, gifts do you want to share with other people, or do you just enjoy doing yourself?
Yeah, I'm about drinking bourbon and talking to people and hanging out with neighbors. Those things, I'm good.
Thank you so much for coming today. Is there any last thoughts you'd like to share?
No, I just really appreciate the opportunity and appreciate your leadership in these conversations. I think that they're going to be a big part of the future.
Well, thank you for all you've done, too.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jason. Thank you for watching today. You can find more information on Starfire at starfirecouncil.org. That's starfirecouncil.org. Thank you for watching today. As well, don't forget to visit jasonsconnection.org.